And so trying to maintain the illusion that this is just one big giant lecture for this entire unit, I want to pick up where we left off in Tuesday's class, which was looking at the kind of the strengths and advantages of incumbency, right? And we looked at how incumbents win at such incredibly high rates, and we looked at the reasons why, their advertising advantage, their credit claiming advantages and fundraising advantages and all that. And so today I just want to kind of pick up with what other factors affect congressional race outcomes. So if incumbency is one of the largest, what else kind of has a role to play in deciding who wins? And so the next most powerful, and arguably the most powerful, um, is a candidate's party identification, right? Party identification, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, even, you represent a brand. And this brand is generally one that your constituents, the people in your district, aka constituents, this brand is one that people in your constituencies want to buy, mostly because your brand aligns with their personal brand. Most members of Congress represent constituencies who share their party ID. Now, the interesting thing is when that changes or when that shifts, right? And so, like, for example, El Paso County has been a solidly Republican stronghold for a very long time, with all the military bases and a couple other like the big mega churches up north and things like that. That there was a strong conservative bent to this area, but we're actually also like changing quite a bit. Um, as a county, and this is shifting a little bit. And so, even though the majority of El Paso County residents probably still identify as Republican and therefore elect Doug Lamborn, also a Republican, this is in the midst of changing. And when it does, Doug Lamborn is most likely going to be out of a job because it's rare that you have a majority Republican state and then elect a Democrat. It does happen, like Senator Joe Manchin in West Virginia is a Democrat in a state where overwhelmingly Republican, but it is rare. And this is accentuated, and this impact of party identification is increased when we talk about gerrymandering, right? And the reasons for this is once you gerrymander a district to fit a certain brand, right? Like I've gerrymandered this district so that Republicans always win it, or I gerrymandered this district so that Democrats always win it. Um, then that party identification increases in impact, right? Like let's take Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House. She's a Democrat and she's been in Congress for a very long time and will likely be there for a very long time more. And bless you, Paige, who's sitting next to me while I'm recording this, um, because she represents San Francisco, right? And the city of San Francisco is as democratic as they come. And I don't even know whether her district is all that gerrymandered, but because of her district being so solidly Democratic, that D next to her name matters a lot. And the reality is it matters a lot because when you talk about brand identity, is that when like voters identify with a certain party, they are likely to vote for that party 90% of the time. So if you as a voter say, I identify more with conservative values or Republican Party, I'm going to vote for Republicans 90% of the time. Every once in a while, I might cross the aisle because there's just that Democrat that I kind of like. He's real, like there's something about him. But most of the time, party identification carries. The other thing that affects congressional race outcomes is political climate, right? And what I mean by that is, how is the nation doing? And there's been numerous instances in United States history where presidents have won or lost not on their popularity for their policies or how they've done in the job, but they've won or lost based on what's going on in the country at that time. Most famously is Jimmy Carter, right? Jimmy Carter is one of the most personally popular presidents to ever serve. The guy is 94 years old and still teaches Sunday school every Sunday, right? He and his wife, who's 92, still build Habitat for Humanity houses like once a month. The guy's always in the news. People love him because he's just like a genuinely good person. But when he lost re-election, he lost it badly because America was in a dark spot, right? We were in a major recession that he likely had nothing to do with and was years in the making. There was significant scandal going on in the Middle East with the Iran-Contra controversy. And so, how the public feels about your job, whether or not you're going to be vulnerable, to winning re-election or not, is oftentimes just as simple as, is the country doing well? Is your district doing well? Is your state doing well? And if the answer is yes, then you have a pretty good chance of winning re-election no matter what you've done. If the answer is no, and people are not loving their life and are not happy with things, then it doesn't really matter what you did for them a year ago, you're probably going to lose. And so this can change pretty quickly. The economy is a huge impactor, right? And I think with Trump losing re-election in 2020, it's very debatable whether he lost because the economy bottomed out as a result of the pandemic, or because the pandemic just, and locking people in their houses for 8 months just soured everyone on everything, or was it just because he was such a raging jerk on Twitter? I think politicians or political scientists will look at this, but it's undeniable that the political climate in America with the pandemic and the economy did not negatively impact his chances for reelection. I think it would have been very difficult for Joe Biden to win, even with all of the division he was sowing on Twitter and whatnot, if the economy was really good and the pandemic never happened. And so political climate can have a huge impact, not just on the presidency, but also congressional races. And that when there is strong anti-Washington sentiment, right? When times are bad and people are blaming Washington, what are you even doing? You're not passing any bills. You're not doing anything. You're all corrupt and a bunch of crooks. That tends to be a time that is particularly bad for Republican or for incumbents, not Republicans. Particularly bad for incumbents. And so take, for example, 2006, strong anti-Washington vibe at the time with the Iraq War not going well, and a recession beginning with the housing market shortly to come, and 6 GOP senators and 23 GOP House members lost. And so, this is a good example of how political climate can work. And then the last thing that can also impact things is coming up on our radar here next year, which is reapportionment, right? The redistricting, right? We're going to see reapportionment because of the 2020 census, and then as a result of reapportionment, we're going to see congressional districts be redrawn. And when that happens, things change. And so let's take, for example, Doug Lamborn, right? Doug Lamborn, Republican, represents El Paso County. Colorado is about to get an additional seat added to it, at least one, arguably two, since we've been gaining in population. And if Colorado gains one seat or two, we're going to redraw the boundaries. And the area that Doug Lamborn represented last year is not going to be the same as what he represents this next year, because some of what he represents will be carved out for the new person, right? And some of Denver probably as well. And so when this happens, the rules can change. Suddenly, last year you were a really good political fit for your constituencies, until, oh crap, they added, they rechanged it, and now Pueblo is a part of the district, right? Or, oh man, yesterday it was pretty solidly Republican, but then we got the southern Denver suburbs moved down into this district. And, and suddenly Doug Lamborn is not as good of an ideological fit for this district as he used to be. Open seats as well. We said open seats invite stronger candidates. We talked about this with incumbency, but it is true. Most of the time, turnover in Congress comes from this, meaning, last year the seat was controlled by a Republican, but that Republican retired. It's changing to a Democrat, and the turnover or the change in Congress isn't necessarily that somebody lost, but that the Republican Party lost the seat because it became an open seat and incumbency wasn't an advantage anymore, and that impacts race outcomes. So the next question we're going to look at here is kind of starting to get at the real nuts and bolts of Congress, how it works. And so before we get into how it works by talking about committee structures and how bills become laws and all that, we want to take a look at why Congress was built the way it was in the first place. And I think as a government teacher, what I love about these kinds of questions is you really do gain an enormous amount of respect for the founders of our nation for just being really, really intelligent in the way that they design things. Um, the fact that we've had one constitution and a functional government that hasn't really changed like fundamental forms in since the founding of our nation is really incredible, but really speaks to the genius behind it. And so let's look at it. We know that the legislative body was built by the framers in the Constitution with the intent of the legislative body being the most powerful branch of Congress or branch of government, right? The three branches of government. The framers wanted the legislative branch to lead, to be the most powerful. And yet, at the same time, they wanted the legislative branch to be the most powerful, but they also recognized that if you're going to have the legislative branch be the most powerful, and the legislative branch is made up of kind of regular people who've, like, before they ran for Congress were doing different things, then we need to design a structure in Congress that empowers these generalists, these people who have a general amount of knowledge about a lot of things, but not an expert level knowledge on very many things. We need to design it so that these generalists can actually make really good policy decisions. That they are not voting on things they know nothing about. They're voting on things that they've been either educated on or has gone through the ranks by other people who know a lot about it. And then by the time the vote happens, right, everyone in Congress is prepared to make informed decisions. And, we're going to talk about this in the later slides, the committee structure, but it begins and ends with that, right? A lot of times we think of Congress as being just the Senate and just the House of Representatives. But the reality is most of the work in Congress, 80% of the work that happens in Congress, does not happen on the floor of the Senate or the floor of the House. 80% of all work that happens in Congress happens in rooms that look like the room in the top right-hand corner of this slide, committee rooms. Some committee rooms are much fancier than this one, some are bigger than this one, but it happens in committee rooms because each member of Congress sits on a couple different committees related to things that generally they have expertise on. And that all bills that eventually go to the Senate floor or the House floor to be voted on have to pass through committees in order to even be voted on the House or Senate floor. And so, in committees is really where you get experts chewing on it and designing it and fixing it and rewriting it to get it to a place where it's now ready to be voted on by these generalists on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives or the Senate. In addition to committee structure, which again, we're going to talk a lot more about because it's a huge part of this unit, we also will look at the history of the fact that we have a Congress different than a lot of other countries where Congress is split into two. It's a bicameral legislature, right? It's made up of two halves, hence the bi, right? And we know we have this bicameral legislature because the history of the Constitutional Convention and how we got there. And we know, that small states like New Jersey and New Jersey Plan wanted every state in America to have equal representation, right? And big states like Virginia had a lot of people said, no, that's not fair. We have way more people than you do, New Jersey. We need to have it based on population. And so, again, for the 20th time this year, that resulted in the Connecticut Compromise, right? The Great Compromise, where they said, fine, we'll do both. All right, in order for a bill to become law, it has to pass through two branches of Congress, both halves. And one half of Congress, every state will have equal, and that's the Senate. Every state has two. And the other half of Congress, the House, will be based on population. And so, bills have to pass through both in order to become law. And this is true in every state, in state level governments too, right? Like Colorado has a Colorado House of Representatives and a Colorado Senate. And Utah has a House of Representatives and Utah Senate. The only state that breaks this is Nebraska. That seems to like take pleasure in doing things differently, both in how they apportion their electoral college votes and how they set up their state legislatures. All right, we'll pick it up in the next one.